matters? Does it show that he was socially and politically content with the status quo, however unequal it might be? Or is it a sign that his communities were largely confined to the relatively well-off and had little or no concern with those who lived in volatile or sometimes desperate conditions? Or are we looking for the wrong thing? Bruce Longenecker, in his important book, Remember the Poor, has recently made an effective argument that Paul was concerned about the material conditions of his communities and indeed of those outside them. The title of his book, Remember the Poor, is taken from a phrase in Galatians where Paul says the Jerusalem apostles requested that he and Barnabas remember the poor, which he says, which very thing we were eager to do. And Bruce Longenecker argues that this request doesn't refer specifically to the Jerusalem collection, but expresses a general insistence on the ethic of the Jewish traditions, which were radicalized by Jesus, which required a collective communal responsibility to care for all members of society, right down to the bottom and right out to the edge. On Bruce's reading, the apostles were urging Paul to make sure that this ethic was inculcated in his Gentile communities, which were not familiar with this distinctively Jewish social concern. Now, as it happens, I don't agree with Bruce Longenecker's reading of that particular text in Galatians, which seems to me to be referring specifically to the collection for Jerusalem that Paul and Barnabas were at that point organizing from the Antioch network of churches. But I do agree with Bruce that there is evidence elsewhere that Paul was alert to the economic conditions of members of his communities and that he issued practical instructions on such matters. Only he doesn't do it in the terms that we might expect. Paul's instructions reflect a model of giving which is not that of the rich benefactors giving to, quote-unquote, the poor, across a vertical distance, as patrons in the ancient world might give support to their chosen clients. Nor does he speak of the random but tiny acts of generosity by which passers-by tossed coins to beggars, as they did indeed in the ancient world, but was regarded normally as an event so fleeting and impersonal that it was doubtful whether it should really be considered gift. Rather, Paul imagines communities of more or less horizontal generosity, by which I mean the mutual support that operates among those at roughly the same social and economic level, but in constantly fluctuating conditions, where a change in material circumstances can require temporary support, on the understanding that the same will happen in reverse when the need arises. You'll remember the picture Paul painted in 2 Corinthians 8, which we discussed last night, where the surplus of one meets the needs of the other, so that that other person's surplus should be given in return in due course in some form. That seems to be a model of a multifaceted, dynamic mutuality that Paul seems to expect within his communities. You've been taught by God, says Paul, to love one another. Note that trademark, one another. Where the community of believers in Thessalonica were both socially and economically squeezed, as it seems they were, Paul encourages them to look to one another for support in a spirit of what he calls Philadelphia, love of fellow siblings. There and elsewhere, he figures the church as a family, not as a charitable institution dependent on the patronage of a few. Bear one another's burdens, he tells the Galatians, where the term burdens might cover the whole gamut of need, material, social, psychological, and so on. In fact, the distinction that we make between economic and other kinds of need seems alien to Paul's way of thinking, reflects the kind of disjunctions that we've created in the modern world where economics is a sphere of its own. You notice how the gifts, the charismata, illustrated in Romans 12, for instance, include all kinds of social, spiritual, and material support, and are followed by instructions to love, to share in the needs of the saints, to offer hospitality. That seems to represent the kind of humdrum forms of everyday practical support, not the kinds of benefaction or patronage that we're inclined to expect. Much of this mundane support seems to be included in that capacious phrase, doing good, that often in antiquity meant material benefit or support. Do not grow weary in doing good, says Paul to the Galatians. Whenever we have the opportunity, that's when our circumstances allow, let us work for the good of all, especially of the household of faith. Words that seem to us extraordinarily vague and general, like goodness or doing good or good works, could be heard in antiquity in quite concrete terms as the performance of everyday acts of material and social assistance by which life is sustained through networks of household support and friendship connections. New Testament scholars have been, I think, somewhat bewitched by Roman-era inscriptions which concern the public benefactions of the elite. The very fact that they're memorialized in inscriptions is an indication that these, on the whole, come from the elite. And we've looked for evidence of Christians as benefactors or patrons in a public form or on a lavish scale that I think was well beyond the range or the expectations of most members of the first Pauline churches. Now, recent decades have seen a long and complex debate concerning the social and economic level of Christians in the Pauline circle, debate often bedeviled by vague terminology. Closer analysis by classicists in recent years has led to greater precision. For instance, Walter Scheidel has done some fascinating modeling of the social scale of wealth in the Roman Empire, while Andrew Wallace Hadrill has used the evidence of Pompeii and Herculaneum to plot the social spectrum in terms of, or in relation to the sizes of living accommodation. Extending this work, Peter Oakes here in Manchester and others have modeled the kind of people we might expect to find in a Pauline house church, who are not the super rich, nor are they, or many of them, typically in utter destitution. What we should imagine is a range of different locations on the social scale, but, and this is the crucial point, very few people, if any, more than 1 or 2 shocks away from acute crisis, and many very close to the edge. Now, ancient society had a degree of precariousness and volatility that would shock us today in the modern West with our multiple forms of insurance and governmental support. An accident, an injury, even a short-term illness, certainly a death, could throw a family immediately into crisis. Extraordinary how many people in the ancient world had accidents just going down the street as things were flung out of windows or the potholes or whatever. It's extraordinary. And you look at ancient skeletons, you note how many people had serious life-threatening injuries, broken legs and broken arms and so on. A poor harvest, a spike in food prices, the loss of work, a landlord who suddenly raises the rent, an unexpected expense, a debt called in with menaces. All such emergencies could pitch a relatively precarious family into destitution. In such uncertain conditions in which unexpected episodes of crisis were in effect the norm, the only security would lie in social networks of trust and mutual commitment, of which the household was the most essential. The people in the ancient world who were wholly destitute, then actually as now, were those whose social networks were lacking. They had collapsed or they were unable to come to their aid. As New Testament examples, think of the beggar Lazarus in Luke 16, or the prodigal son who was so much on his own that, quote, no one would give him anything. right? He's out, he's not in a network, he's completely isolated from family and other networks, and that's the most precarious position to be. It was possible to survive in the precarious circumstances we find in antiquity only if one built and maintained a network of mutually supportive relations, where small acts of reciprocal benefit established relations of trust and esteem necessary to provide the help one needed in unpredictable emergencies. Sharing food, looking after children, nursing the sick, offering a loan, sharing tools, making clothes, giving hospitality. These are the kinds of small-scale acts. These are what we should think of as good works that were never memorialized in inscriptions, but that kept the majority of the population from going under on a day-to-day basis. Paul himself was a craft worker with precarious employment, and he wrote to some of his converts assuming that they too worked with their own hands. Although the Corinthian church may have included some comparatively wealthy members, even then, however, probably not the super rich, most of that church, as of all Paul's other churches, were neither wealthy nor powerful. Remember how Paul instructs them at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 16 to put aside money for the Jerusalem collection week by week and only as they could afford. He assumes that they don't have a healthy bank balances on which they could draw at sudden request. If there's going to be money, it's no point him suddenly turning up and saying, now I need some money from you, because if they haven't been storing up a tiny little bit week by week, there wouldn't be anything. He seems to acknowledge that in some weeks they might have nothing at all to spare. In these conditions, it makes good sense that he should inculcate an ethos not of top-down charity, but of mutual or reciprocal support, where what matters most of all is mutual recognition. That is, the sense of being responsible for one another. And where the most common model for that relationship is not patron and client, but sibling and fellow sibling. Like other early Christians, Paul drew on a long Jewish tradition where the responsibility of the community for all of its own, even the poorest, was prominent in the scriptures and, as it were, baked into its practices. This could be expressed in bitter attacks on the rich who neglected their responsibilities to the poor and accumulated wealth for themselves, the sort of polemics we find in the prophets and echoed in the sayings of Jesus and the letter of James. But the Jewish tradition was actually quite internally varied and adaptable, and was also expressed in practical instructions concerning the responsibility of members of the Jewish community, who were often figured, indeed, as brothers and sisters. Responsibility to support one another with loans, with meals, emergency gifts. Such an ethos must have kept many a poor Jewish person afloat in difficult circumstances, though sometimes it found expression in more permanent forms of mutual support. There's evidence in the Qumran scrolls, for instance, for a kind of insurance system created by people pooling a part of their wages week by week to deal with sudden emergencies. That's in the Damascus document. Now, the early Christians, of course, drew on this rich and varied tradition and adapted it for their own social arrangements. Where there were rich Christians who could act as patrons to the community, then indeed heavy pressure was put on them to divert their wealth away from luxury, from their own households, into the family of the church. You find that in Luke and in the Shepherd of Hermas, and later when, in the 2nd century, some super wealthy converts joined the church. But top-down patronage was not the only possible model. There could also be forms of partial pooling, as imagined in the early chapters of Acts, made possible in less idealized forms once the church had a common treasury and economic overseers. But there could also be humdrum forms of inter-household support, the good works that are spoken of in the Pauline letters and in 1 Peter. The ethos that encourages, for instance, in the letter to the Ephesians, encourages a thief to work with his hands that he might have something to share with the needy. Low key, he's not a patron for anybody, he's just giving what he can when he can. Later on you find in early Christianity a very interesting tradition which is sometimes labeled social fasting, where there's instructions that if there are people among you who are hungry, you should fast for 3 days so that you have something to give to them. Very interesting instruction. It presumes you won't have anything to give to them unless you fast. You haven't got any spare resources yourself. But if you fast, you will be able to share your food with those who are needy. That tradition of social fasting. You see what sort of small scale, tiny kind of gifts we're talking about here, but very meaningful and keeping people from starvation in critical moments. There are many ways of supporting the poor other than top-down donations from the wealthy. And where most people were poor, in the sense that they were only 1 or 2 shocks away from destitution, it doesn't make sense to talk about the poor as a group other than or lower than yourself. The ethos in Paul's churches is, I think, this ethos of horizontal support within and between households, rarely spectacular or large scale, but nonetheless crucial for survival in the volatile conditions of life. Of course, to give at all, you must have or must be able to generate something surplus to spare, but the difference in condition between giver and receiver might be very small and was likely to fluctuate all the time. Now, mutual aid and reciprocal benefaction sound attractive, but in truth, they are very difficult to establish and maintain, especially when they're expected to operate across the normal household boundaries. Just think of this. Because benefits are not returned at once or in the same form, and because their worth cannot be calculated precisely, one gives aid to somebody else, hoping for a return when you need it, but never completely sure that your gift will be reciprocated. Now, within a household, family, and its extended members, there are strong sanctions to ensure that trust is honored and gifts are returned. But within the household of faith, where there's no history of trust, and where relationships cross family, social, even ethnic lines, how could you be sure that the aid would be reciprocated when you needed a return? There is just endless scope here for grievance and complaint and envy. Givers are apt to think that they give more than they ever receive. Recipients are apt to complain that the aid they need comes too slowly, or is given reluctantly, or is given in a humiliating form. Even at the best of times, and even small gifts are complex and fraught with difficulty. And in the New Testament, we find repeated calls for generosity, patience, love, peace, and kindness, together with warnings against envy, anger, hostility, and jealousy. And we're tempted to think that all sounds far too obvious to need saying. But anyone who started a new community where there are high expectations of mutual aid will know that reciprocity is a fragile phenomenon, often misunderstood, sometimes exploited. And with a little imagination, we can easily appreciate how the early Christians struggled to love one another as they were exhorted to do. In what follows, I'm going to take 2 examples from 1 Corinthians where we can see Paul attempt to inculcate this ethos of mutual care, and where we can appreciate some of the practical problems that might be encountered. So let's start with the body in 1 Corinthians 12. Communal unity is one of the themes that runs right through 1 Corinthians, but the famous metaphor of the body, developed in chapter 12, indicates that this unity is differentiated. That is to say, it arises from a diversity in which the body is bound together by the giving and receiving of gifts. What are here classed as charismata or pneumatica are varied in form and different, in fact, from the lists we find in Romans 12 and Ephesians 4. But the fact that they are labeled charismata and pneumatica indicates that they derive from the charis, benefit or favor of God, and are sourced from the Spirit. As Paul says earlier in this letter, what do you have that you haven't received? What happens in the body is the circulation of gifts, sourced from elsewhere, possessed by individual believers, but not in the proper sense owned, and possessed only in order to be shared. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common benefit. The metaphor of the body was widely used in antiquity for all sorts of social groups, even for the cosmos as a whole, and it could be put to many different uses. So it's important to observe carefully exactly how it is deployed here. Paul begins with a general statement about plurality and unity, and then spells out what that means. Whether we're all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free. The labels he indicates here, the labels that he selects here indicate that the kinds of diversity Paul has in mind include diversity of status. As a free person and as a Jew, Paul knew that people in these categories didn't think of themselves as just different, but different and unequal, different and superior. A slave could perform a service. It's not at all clear in the ancient world whether a slave could give a gift. And yet Paul is here describing the distribution of gifts between slaves and free. This already suggests that Paul is going to scramble some of the standard hierarchical associations of the body metaphor. And we're going to trace his thought now quickly through a sequence of 3 steps, which then lead to the goal. So here's step 1, verses 14 to 19, which is up on the screen here, 1 Corinthians 12, 14 to 19. Now, at first glance, these verses seem to say only that a body has diverse components and wouldn't be a body if it all one part. That's indeed the main thrust of this section of text. But note that Paul looks at this topic from the point of view of members who might feel unrecognized, articulating the sense that they do not belong. If the foot were to say, verse 15, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. So also for the ear, because it's not an eye. Paul's giving speech here to a part of the body. He's anthropomorphizing it. And he invites us to think of people who might think of themselves or are being told to think of themselves as having no significant role to play. Now, as we shall see, that strikes a nerve in the church in Corinth, because there are people in the church in Corinth who are being treated in a way as if they don't matter. Paul counters that perception of unimportance very firmly. The most important thing to say is that every member matters, because God has designed it to be so. Verse 18, as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose. So whatever superior members of the body might think, God has placed everyone in this body, and that means they're significant. One is reminded of Paul's perspective on the church, as it were, from below in the opening chapters of the letter. Consider your call, he says. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. That powerful statement is indicating a community where the normal standards of worth don't apply. So let's move to step 2. Can we put step 2? There we go. A very short step. The body is constituted by relations of mutual need. Since the body is introduced in the context of gifts, we might expect Paul to emphasize how each part of the body makes a contribution to the other. That's implied throughout. But the emphasis here, notably, is the other way around, not on what they have to give, but on what they need to receive. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. Note that word need. It indicates insufficiency, vulnerability, dependence. What Paul evokes is the awareness that no part of the body is self-sufficient. No one is a giver and not also a receiver. The dynamic that binds the body together requires gifts to circulate in all directions, going out and coming back. Now, the gift and return need not be bilateral. There are more than two parts to the body. And gifts will be shared around the body in both direct and indirect forms of reciprocity. What one gives may be matched by a gift not coming from the recipient, but from elsewhere in the community. But note the principle of reciprocity, so basic to Paul's social ethics. Just as elsewhere, believers are to greet one another, encourage one another, welcome one another, warn or instruct one another, above all to love one another, so here the gifts given and received in the body of Christ flow in all directions. They are sourced in God, and all parties thereby participate in the generosity and the self-giving love of God. They enter this loving momentum of God, not only when they give in the momentum of gift from God, but also when they receive. Because what they receive is the same momentum of grace as it comes to them from others. To decline others' gifts would be to deny them the dignity of participating themselves in that flow of grace. So let's move to step 3. The body is designed for relations of reciprocal asymmetry. It'll come up in a minute, I'm sure. Verses 22 to 25. As a direct implication of what he's just said, Paul pays particular attention to power relations within the body and the treatment of those that seem less important. The members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and those members of the body we think less honorable we clothe with greater honor. Now, whether he's thinking of the internal organs of the body or the genitalia or both, Paul's emphasis here in ancient terms is really unusual. Instead of reinforcing a hierarchy of honor in which the ruling parts of the body are accorded the superior respect that they consider they are due, Paul thinks of the ways in which apparently lesser parts of the body are given greater honor. Very strikingly, this is not just a compensatory honor that brings them up, as it were, to the level of others, so they're all on an equal plane, but greater honor that highlights even their superior status. God has so arranged the body, giving the greater honor to the inferior member. And as Dale Martin has noted, the normal connection between status and honor is here questioned. Those who on the surface occupy positions of lower status are actually more essential than those of higher status, and therefore should be accorded more honor. There's a scrambling of normal expectations here, which would be confusing if it were a static phenomenon, but it makes good sense if Paul regards power relations as in a state of continuous flux. An asymmetry of power and status in one direction or one respect is constantly shifting to be overturned by an asymmetry in the other direction. What seems to be envisaged, in other words, is a continuous renegotiation of relationships, where those with the power to give, which is always in some respects a position of superiority, are allowed to exercise that power, but only because at another time or in another respect, the recipients of that gift will themselves have the power to give or to give back, and the former givers will become recipients. It's a process we might call reciprocal asymmetry. It represents not a static equality, but a dynamic momentum of rolling inversions, where an inequality in one direction is altered by an inequality in the other. All members are equally recipient of of divine gifts, but in the play of reciprocity between them, the power of giving constantly shifts. And so the goal. The goal, verses 25 and 26, is the solidarity formed by mutual recognition. Paul reaches the conclusion in these words, that there may be no dissension within the body, but that members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it. Paul's Greek might be better translated that there may be no division. If the body is truly interdependent, it cannot afford to be divided, or it would lose features essential to its functioning. But what Paul envisages here is more than just a kind of holding together. What he outlines is a kind of comprehensive solidarity, where every member cares equally about every other and shares in their wounds or their joys. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that such solidarity is only possible on the basis of mutual recognition. It depends on knowing and treating one another as people who belong together and will flourish or fail together. In Paul's world, as today, it was easy to be indifferent to the suffering of those who you did not consider integral to your circle of attention. Wealthier citizens in the ancient world might be persuaded to meet the needs of fellow citizens, but hardly of foreigners or slaves. Families might care about their own household members, but strangers in the street could be pushed out of the way. They didn't matter because they didn't belong. In general, the sufferings of slaves, the homeless, foreigners, and criminals were of no concern. Might in some circumstances even be the source of entertainment, because they were outside the community of those that mattered. Paul's comments thus reflect a basic social psychological insight. You'll only care about the sorrows of others once you recognize those sorrows as also, in some sense, your own. Indeed, once you recognize the other as a part of yourself. If one member suffers, all members suffer with it, sum pasce. If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it, sun kaire. Note that favorite Pauline preposition, sun, with. Each self is joined to a communal whole, but without losing its individuality or its hope of flourishing. And this requires recognizing the other as essential to your own flourishing and vice versa. If a member were to harm the community, he would be harming himself. If she were to honor and benefit the community, she would be benefiting also herself. The solidarity of the body entails a mutual identification such that we can no longer identify one part's interests as in competition with the interests of others. And the reason that Paul discusses honor in this passage in the context of communal solidarity is because the act of recognition of the other as one with oneself is essential if the community is to be more than merely superficial. So let's move on to the communal meal and move back a chapter from 1 Corinthians 12 to 1 Corinthians 11. I'll be a little briefer on this. Just before his discussion of the body, Paul had rebuked the Corinthians for the way that they conducted their communal meals. The time he spends on this issue, second half of 1 Corinthians 11, the very weighty threats of divine judgment, indicate how important these meals are in the formation or the deformation of the community. Now, as is widely recognized, meals in antiquity were a central mode of social interaction and recognition. But there are different kinds of meals. There are meals in the home, there are meals in a larger social gathering, there are meals with civic and with religious connotations. And we might perhaps illuminate this by a notion we could derive from anthropology of different transactional orders. At the lowest level, there is the domestic or household transactional order, where the everyday processes of market exchange, buying and selling of goods, enter into the pooled provision of the household. It's necessary, but it has the lowest moral and religious weight. Above this stands a social transactional order, social in the sense of crossing household boundaries, forms of interaction and exchange within groups, associations, and civic transactions. These stand at a higher level as they're given greater moral and social weight. And if someone, for instance, prioritizes their own household over the common good, or deflects what should be civic resources to their private gain, they're open to criticism as greedy or antisocial. At the highest level, the top level, is sacred exchange. That is to say, the transactional order of exchange with the divine, which is often evoked to some extent within the lower levels, but it takes the highest moral ground inasmuch as any domestic or social transaction that ignores or diminishes the honor due to the gods was criticized in the sharpest tones. A farmer, for instance, who fails to offer sacrifices to the gods from his harvest is the object of immediate criticism as irreligious. An association president who starts off the meal but offers only paltry sacrifices to the presiding deities will be criticized heavily. Worse still, a thief who steals temple property. All such failures or insults to the sacred exchange that should orient all material transactions are liable to the most intense criticism. Now, for Paul, the Corinthians' communal meals, when they come together as an assembly, are a scandal on every front. They have debased what should be a social meal to purely private greed, where still they have turned the Lord's meal into individualized appropriation. Now, we don't know how often the Corinthian community met for meals, but I think we should assume that whatever meals they shared were what Paul calls the Lord's Supper. That is, a meal in honor of the Lord. Because every meal in the ancient world had some kind of religious connotation. You'd have to say, whenever you had a meal together, well, whose honor is this in? And I think every meal would be in honor of the Lord, with words and acts that orient the meal to Christ. Coming together for such a meal should be, in Paul's words, for the better. That is, it should go up the transactional orders, but in fact, in Corinth, it's for the worse. It's not, he says, the Lord's Supper that they eat, because they each go ahead with or appropriate their own meal. Far from creating or affirming social bonds, there are divisions, schismata, such that, as Paul describes it, one is hungry and another is drunk. This is not just an unequal distribution of food and drink. The excess of some, it is implied, is at the expense of others. The inequality is an expression of competition and disregard, and one of Paul's most stinging comments is that they thereby despise the assembly of God. If we could perhaps move on to the next slide, thank you. They thereby despise the assembly of God and humiliate those who have nothing. This is verse 22 there. Now, in recent decades, there's been a lot of scholarly discussion regarding the cause of this dysfunctional situation. Gerd Tyson argued the divisions in the community were socioeconomic, that wealthier members of the assembly who provided the food and hosted the meals were displaying the typically supercilious behavior of the privileged. Peter Lamper suggested the food was meant to be brought by everybody, a kind of potluck meal, but that some arrived too late for the meal proper and only in time for the more formal and exiguous parts of the meal. John Kloppenborg has suggested the food was paid for by member subscriptions or donations by the wealthy, and it exhibited the inequalities of food and honor typical of association meals. In truth, it's, I think, quite hard to press behind Paul's rhetoric to the actual situation in Corinth. But his description of these meals accords with a common critique of the distortion of social relationships by those with superior power. If we could move to the next slide. The fable, much recycled in antiquity, comes down to us from the collection attributed to Aesop, the fable of the lion's share. You've all heard the lion's share. Well, this is the story that phrase comes from. Lots of different slight modifications of it in antiquity, but this is perhaps the most straightforward here. A wild ass and a lion were partners in the hunt. And the verb in the Greek version of this is koinoneo. The lion excelled in strength, while the ass excelled in speed. When they'd made a large killing of animals, the lion divided the booty and arranged it in 3 portions. Now, this first portion, he said, I shall take myself because I am king. And I shall take that second also as being a partner with you on equal terms. As for this third portion, you'll come to some harm if you don't get lost. Now, what was meant to be a shared meal has become the lion's alone. He had the power to make it so. In the Corinthian case, the power differential may have arisen from differences in wealth and social prestige, but what scandalizes Paul is that the meal that was meant to express their recognition of one another across households and social divides is achieving the exact opposite. Some leave the meal knowing that they are considered worthless. You humiliate those who have nothing to eat at this meal. Those who have nothing here are not, I think, the destitute, because Paul assumes that everyone has something to eat at home, but they're those who are left with nothing to eat, or next to nothing to eat, at this meal. The powerful members of the assembly have debased this meal, such as no longer the Lord's Supper and no longer an act of social recognition. They've degraded it into a form of individual greed. Why then does Paul then remind them of the Last Supper tradition? And we'll perhaps put that slide up next, with its rehearsal of the words and actions of Jesus on the night that he was handed over. Now, scholars have struggled to explain quite how this is relevant to the Corinthian context, but I think the key lies in the contrast between what he's just said about the humiliation of some members at the meal, the contrast between that and the opening words of Jesus at the Last Supper. This is for you. Those words give every person at the meal their worth, establishing the honor that they deserve. In repeating this tradition in these verses here, Paul doesn't recount the death of Jesus itself, but he recounts the actions and words by which Jesus interpreted that death. And in recalling those actions and words, note he omits nearly all the specificity of their original context. It was a past event on the night that he was handed over. But note that in this tradition there's no Judas, there are no disciples, not even in an anonymous form. The only people indicated in this little narrative are Jesus and you. Jesus took the bread, he gave thanks and broke it and said, "This is my body, do this in memory. This is my body for you, do this in memory of me." To whom is Jesus speaking? It might as well be the Corinthians themselves. Indeed, Jesus' words here, verse 25, Jesus' words, "whenever you drink this," are picked up in Paul's comment, "whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup." So that the you, addressed by Jesus, is merged with the you, addressed by Paul. In other words, whenever the Corinthians share the Lord's meal, these words are present, contemporary, live in Corinth. Thus, the first and most important words that the Corinthians hear from Jesus is a simple, stripped-down statement, "This is my body for you," or literally, "This is my body, this for you." The death of Jesus for each one of you is what gives them their worth. Elsewhere, where Paul urges the powerful in Corinth, and again in Rome, to pay regard to those they considered weak or ill-informed, he uses this same motif to highlight the importance to Christ of those disregarded. Through your knowledge, he says to the Corinthian knowledgeable, the weak brother is destroyed, the one for whom Christ died. The fact that Christ died for them is what is the basis of their worth, which depends not on their education, their knowledge, their social status, their ethnicity, or their wealth, but on one fact alone: they matter to Christ. In repeating this tradition, the Corinthian assembly is to reground itself in the event that forms its foundation, an event which is not any natural attribute or social construction, an event which is extrinsic to them all, that is, the death of Christ for each and every person. If they don't recognize this at the meal, if they humiliate members of the community has lost its whole meaning. Note here that in describing the Lord's Supper, Paul is not prescribing a soup kitchen or a food distribution service. If we're looking for that, we're bringing the wrong expectations. But he is describing community-forming meals, which he insists must display the equal recognition of honor on which all their habits of mutual care depend. It's in this small scale but highly weighted act of recognition that takes place regularly at the Lord's meal that the Corinthians will reproduce again and again their relationships of interdependence. And those relationships of interdependence and recognition will form the basis and the frame for intermittent but potentially life-saving acts of support by which brothers and sisters will survive through the ever-volatile conditions of urban life. It's only if they care about one another that they will ever, when needed, give to one another. And they'll only care if they afford to one another the esteem that each is due. Okay, time to wrap up. If we expect Paul to issue repeated instructions on giving charity to the poor, we'll be disappointed. With the exception of the poor among the saints in Jerusalem, the poor are not a separate category of people within or outside the church, partly because, like Paul himself, many, if not most, members of his churches were often themselves in economic need. In conditions of extreme volatility and vulnerable to sudden changes of circumstances, what most people in antiquity needed was not a weekly meal at a soup kitchen, not an occasional handout from a patron, welcome as both of those might be. What they needed was the security of a network of people who cared enough to stand by them at those inevitable moments when the chips were down. It didn't matter if the network was composed, for the most part, of people in similar and similarly fluctuating conditions. In fact, that made people more willing to give, knowing that they would one day need help in return. What Paul seeks to create are networks of mutual care with strong links that somehow manage to cross social and household boundaries. In such communities, meeting the needs of the saints or doing good to the household of faith is expected to become a routine part of social life as needs arise. And such aid is envisaged as supplementing, or in some cases substituting for, the familial systems of care that kept people afloat in the ancient world. Basic to this system and essential for its operation was mutual recognition. That is, according to each other, the affirmation that their lives truly mattered, which for Paul derived from the fact that they matter to Christ. Within such communities of horizontal generosity, Paul expected patterns of interdependence and mutual support, by which benefits of various sorts circulated in all directions, a kind of diffused reciprocity based on a shared responsibility or solidarity that Paul calls koinonia. As we've seen, Paul was acutely aware of the power dimensions in such relations of gift and reciprocity and sought to find means by which a power inequality in one direction could be matched by a power dynamic of an opposite kind. Those are the themes: gift, reciprocity, solidarity, esteem, power, that I hope to explore with you further tomorrow night when we wrap up this series of lectures by asking, well, are there resources here for us today in our thinking afresh about the common good? Thanks very much for being with me tonight.
Thanks once again for such a stimulating lecture. I told you already that indeed I felt my heart strangely warmed for a couple of moments. We are going to open the floor for questions now, both from here in person and from the online participant. I'm hoping that Facebook live streaming is working okay at the moment, right? I think we have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So I'm going to invite my colleague Ezekiel to take the questions from the online viewers. That'd be okay? Yeah. So, well, the floor is open. Anyone has any questions? Yes, Tom Noble, please. Yeah.
Thank you so much again for such an interesting lecture. I think it was about 10 years ago, Professor Nigel Bigger gave the Didsbury Lectures and enunciated a principle which he repeated last year in a Tyndale lecture, that while I have an obligation to the whole world to supply their needs, I am required to give priority to those in my own family, community, perhaps that would also include nation. And from your exposition, that does seem to me to be quite a Pauline position. Would Paul agree?
Thank you. The one moment where I think he makes an explicit comment on that when he says in Galatians 6, do good to all, and especially the household of faith. Which manages to combine a sense of a universal commitment, but the "and especially" suggests there is an inner focus to it. I think if you think in practical terms of the ancient world, where 80% of the population live at or only just above the subsistence level, and you think of people who are themselves living in that context, to say to them, you are responsible for sorting out the poverty of the whole Roman Empire, would have been just an absurd thing to suggest. You start where you are. But what is interesting is that it isn't just boxed into where you are, because there is always that universal do good to all. And I think if you follow this through, in the pre-Constantinian era, the churches did primarily support their own, but they kept this tradition going that you should also love your enemies. You should also love those who persecute you. You should also love the outsider. And this could take very, very practical expressions. Tertullian, just in passing, has this lovely comment about someone who came across who'd been stung by a scorpion, which is life-threatening. He said, I prayed for him. I prayed that he would be better. And you think, well, in Christian terms, that was an act of significant good for that person. And so I think you get this sense that the Christians, yes, they were building communities of mutual care into which people were drawn, partly because they would receive material support there, but it wasn't totally in-house. In other words, they were constantly also creating what anthropologists would call weak links, which they hoped might eventually turn strong as they did good to all. Now, in the post-Constantinian era, when the empire thinks of itself as, well, we're a single Christian empire now, then of course, then you have to kind of rethink this whole thing, because then everybody, all the poor in the world are in a sense part of the body of Christ, or potentially, much more potentially so. And then you have to rethink this. Well, then maybe we are responsible for every single poor person in this city in a much more direct way, do you see, than they might have done before then. But I think even before Constantine, there is this there is this ambiguity in the sense like we're first and foremost, we're giving support to our brothers and sisters, and that language was very powerful. But there's always, it's fascinating how often they come back to those words of Jesus about loving the outsider and including the enemy. Yeah.
Do you have any questions from the online viewers?
So this is from Patrick Duffy. The more I have listened, I have been thinking that Paul may in fact be presenting a form of theology of liberation, giving a basis for ecclesial-based communities and a preferential option for the poor. Would this be the case?
Well, thank you. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because liberation theology has generally not founded itself on Paul. It's usually, if it's taking biblical resources from elsewhere, and obviously particularly the Old Testament texts, and particularly the Gospels. And you can see that if you're looking, as I say, if you're looking for statements about the poor, as it were, then you're not going to find a lot of them in Paul. But what I'm suggesting is there's actually something more interesting, going on in Paul, precisely because it is about building what you might call base communities, indeed, and in which that mutual support is not about top-down, big charitable donations. It's about that mutual help at a horizontal level. So, I think you'd have to add quite a lot of extra theological resources to turn that into, as well, a liberation theology. The big question you'd have to ask of Paul is, yes, fine, we're helping each other, one another, but are we questioning the large social structures that have brought this inequality about? And I think you'd struggle to find that from Paul himself. You'd have to go elsewhere in biblical traditions, I think, to find that. But then, Paul has never been the only thing in the Bible, has he? I think what I'd say is that the big sort of structural questions about how society is organized are not the questions that Paul himself is addressing. But there are questions that liberation theology asks when it goes, not just, famously, not just do you give to the poor, well, why are there the poor in the first place? But Paul has resources certainly for thinking about forming communities. I've got actually a PhD student who's from Argentina and who's connecting Pauline resources to the Argentinian form of liberation theology, the theology of the people, as it's called, which is where Pope Francis actually gets a lot of his inspiration. As you know, there's many different kinds of liberation theology, but the Argentinian form is very much starting with the communities and the spirituality of poor communities, rather than starting with sort of big concepts from Marxism or whatever. And my student is saying there's actually quite a lot of interesting resonance there. If you read Paul the way I've been suggesting here, you see a lot of resonance with the way the theology of the people has emerged in Argentina.
Oh, thank you for the answer. Yes, please. I'd like to come up.
Thank you. So as you're describing this mutual reciprocity, my mind goes to Acts chapter 2 and the community of believers there, as well as again with Ananias and Sapphira, where in those circumstances they're actually selling assets, and therefore actually presumably making themselves even more precarious than they were previously. And so would this, in Paul, be a development of that, perhaps like a more conservative way of operating as the community of believers, or is it simply a continuation of that?
That's interesting. Thank you. I think what you could say is I don't find evidence in in the Pauline letters that we've been discussing of a pooling of resources. What you find in Acts 2 and Acts 4 is a deliberate policy of pooling, isn't it? When you're actually selling assets and putting them into a pool. If you have a pool, you also have to have leaders who are going to oversee the distribution of resources. Now, we find evidence for that, I think, in the pastoral epistles, where we have the question about who and how are you going to support widows, and are they going to be supported by the church? And you have overseers, episcopoi, which is often a financial term for financial oversight. And so I think you get a hint there, at least, of, I would date the pastorals to the end of the 1st century, so after the life of Paul. And you get in letters of Ignatius, at the beginning of the 2nd century, you then get a reference to a church treasury, which is definitely a pooled resource. And then the question is who has the right to call upon it and for what purposes. So I just think that's a different model. I'm not sure which is more conservative or which is more, radical, because I think they're just different models. As I say, pooling requires a degree of organization and permanency, and leadership and control, which has its pluses and its minuses. Yeah. Although Acts describes it as they sold all that they had, in fact, it then talks about people still having their own houses and so on, and so you wonder whether that language is actually is it describing actually what we would call more like a partial pooling rather than a total pooling of all they had. And we do have parallels to that kind of partial pooling I mentioned from the Dead Sea Scrolls, for instance. So people tried different economic models. And I think what you find in Paul's letters is, the ones we've been discussing, is not, I think, yet evidence for pooling, but more a sense of everybody has a responsibility for everybody else. And therefore, I'll help you out, not from some common pot, but from my own resources as I can, on the understanding that you'll help me and other members of the community when you can. Yeah, thanks. That's a good question.
There are several good questions. I'm just going to go first come, first serve basis. You hinted at the relationship between material and spirit gifts. Could you expand on it? For instance, were the poor more likely to have gifts of prophecy?
I don't know whether there's any hint of certain people, of certain, whether economic status would correlate in any way with particular kinds of leadership. In fact, that's perhaps one of the most interesting things, that you don't have that correlation, because you would expect, Paul would say, well, only the educated people here are allowed to be the teachers, or only certain people would be allowed to take leadership roles. Only certain people are apostles. And in fact, he doesn't go that way, and anybody apparently could receive a prophecy. And as you know, interestingly and famously, in that complex passage at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 11, he expects women to pray and to prophesy. Those being the two most important forms of speech, in his opinion, in the church: prayer, speech to God on behalf of the community, and prophecy, speech from God to the community, which he regards as a more important form of speech than speaking in tongues, for instance. So I think there's something kind of interestingly, to use our modern term, democratic about the way he thinks about gifts, which are distributed as God allocates and not according to our our expectations and our hierarchies. So what it would certainly mean is that, yes, a poor person could be a prophet. And what you'd interestingly find is, of course, the phenomenon in early Christianity of the traveling prophet, who is very poor and very, very vulnerable, and who, famously, the text we know as the Didache, says, if the prophet comes, you should give them hospitality. But if they stay for more than 3 days, they're not a proper prophet, and you should tell them to get on their way. It's a good text to put up if you've got people who stay over long with you, actually. So we do have this fascinating phenomenon, and you can see how it grows out of the Jesus tradition of the wandering charismatic, as Gerd Tyson called them, the prophet. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we still have some time for a couple more questions. Does anyone have questions here? Yes, please.
Thank you so much again for a very stimulating lecture. I couldn't help when you were talking a little bit about this people in very precarious situations in life of my own background on a farm where you're 1 day away from a bad crop and or a snowstorm coming or something and neighbors coming to help you along. And there was a mutuality there that occurs, which then raised me the question, this never seemed to me to be transactional. And you use that phrase transactional, and I'm wondering if you would explain a bit more what you mean by that.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I was using it as a sort of anthropologist term. It doesn't quite mean. Yeah, we think of the word transaction as very sort of calculating, don't we? And it's kind of okay. So I'm using it as a sort of like a theoretical term for just forms of exchange, rather than. So perhaps it is unhelpful for that reason. The anthropologists just mean it for an exchange in which something comes in one direction, something comes back. But you're right. In fact, that in the kind of horizontal generosity that we're talking about, it's really important not to keep a tally in a certain way. It's really important not to be kind of demanding. It's important to give, to be there for your friends. But the hidden knowledge is, and they'll be there for you, but you don't know when you'll need it, or so you're not chalking it up in some sort of way, which means there is an openness to it. It can also mean, of course, that the grievances can begin. I don't know if I'm sure in your farming community they didn't, but I can imagine, in some circumstances where, like, I really helped you out last year, and I gave you 5 days of help last year, and all you've done is send your useless son to help me for a day. This sort of thing, where you can sort of feel I'm not getting quite I'm not getting back quite what I gave. So that sort of informality or that non-calculating form can be wonderfully flexible. It can also be problematic at times, perhaps. Yeah. But thank you. I'll heed what you say about the word transaction.
If this construal of gift reciprocity is rooted in the reality of the Christ event, that is the basis of this mutual reciprocity, is Christ's death for all, then what are the possibilities for this form of gift reciprocity in a culture that does not take the Christ event as central, as a central story or reality? Does one need to find another universal principle, or is it only possible in the church?
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm going to address this a little bit tomorrow, but I'll say this here. Christians have reasons for thinking that Christ's love is not restricted just to themselves. As Paul puts it, he died for all. Therefore, every person is, in the Christian's eyes, of worth to God, because Christ died for them. Other people outside the church wouldn't share that recognition. Absolutely, they wouldn't. They would have other reasons built in, notions of human rights or universal principles of some other sort that might give people dignity, which means that Christians within their own framework have lots of bridges they can build with other people who would give a different rationale. It doesn't mean Christians give up their own rationale, but they just have as well lots of points of overlap where coalitions are possible with people who have another faith perspective or a secular perspective on why people why their lives matter. So there are distinctive theological reasons for thinking what we think, which we know are not shared by everybody, but we think they apply to everybody. And if other people have if they reach the same conclusion from different points of view or reach similar conclusions, we can work with them. That's fine. As you know, the UN Declaration of Universal Rights. Nobody could agree on the basis for those rights. Actually, when they drew it all up in the 1940s, they said we can just about agree on these things, but we have wildly different religious and philosophical and non-religious reasons for thinking this. But they said, well, that's okay. We won't go too far into the reasons. The American Constitution said we take it as self-evident that all people have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By 1947, it wasn't self-evident anymore, so nobody could. But it was okay, so long as you could make coalitions among yourselves that you basically would agree at the same conclusions. So I think that's something like that we work with in a multicultural, multi-faith environment. We have distinctively Christian reasons for thinking that everybody's life matters. And other people have other reasons, but that's fine. We can work together for a common goal if we agree on those central things. So there's sort of overlaps there. That's the way I would try and express it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Anyone has any burning questions before we close, or are we all okay? Well, thank you. Thanks again for this stimulating lecture and your clarity in answering the questions. Well, thank you, all of you who are here this evening, and those who are actually joining by online. And thanks so much for your questions as well on chat. Please remember that Professor Barclay is going to deliver the final lecture tomorrow evening. The same time, the same place, 7:30 in the British time, here at Nazarene Theological College. And if you are joining by Facebook live streaming, it will be the same link, the same time.